am so excited to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day. Starting us off is Victor Hwang. And Victor is the former Vice President of Economic Development at the Kauffman Foundation. And he's now the founder and CEO of Right to Start. Victor is a lifelong champion of entrepreneurship. Born to an immigrant family in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Victor's work has taken him across the globe. He's proud to have helped over 300 communities, cities, states, and companies in creating greater economic prosperity. His economic development clients have included World Bank, Ford Foundation, Inter-American Development Bank, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. He has also worked with corporate clients seeking to grow entrepreneurial innovation, including Accenture, IBM, and Microsoft. Today, he'll be sharing with us how we can create prosperity in our own communities. Victor, welcome.
Good morning. Great to see everybody. It's such a delight to be here. I drove up from Kansas City yesterday, where I live right now, and it was just this beautiful, spectacular drive. And all along the way, we had these 6-foot-high prairie grass with wildflowers of every possible color. And it was just a lovely day. And we're here on a beautiful, bright morning Albert Lea. I've never been to Albert Lea before, but I've really enjoyed the welcome here, and we had a wonderful dinner last night. Thank you to Tim and to Pam and to Cassie and everyone else who hosted this event. It's really wonderful to be here. So a little bit about myself. As Cassie mentioned, I am the son of immigrants from Taiwan. I was born in 1971, so thank you for helping me celebrate my 50th birthday this year. Thank you. It is an accomplishment. And so my parents came to this country with $300 and 2 bags of laundry. They came as students, and they lived the American dream. And they were educators when they started. And so when I was fortunate enough to get into Harvard for college, they really wanted to send me. It meant a lot for an immigrant family to be able to do that. But they couldn't afford it. So first they had to take out a second mortgage on their home. So they put everything on the line to send me to college. And the next thing they did is they started a business. And they actually started a business that made enough income to be able to put me through college and now provide a retirement for themselves. So I've seen the power of entrepreneurship, and it's very personal to me because I know how it can transform lives, and I know how it can shape futures and how it can create opportunity for people. But I also know how hard it is. I saw how hard it was for them to be able to struggle through the sleepless nights, the tension, the migraine headaches, the difficulties, the turmoil of starting and growing a business for people who really had never done it before. In fact, they'd started before once and didn't work, and they had to do it again the second time. But they built a company, and so I saw what happened, all the things that they had to struggle with along the way. And so when I went to Harvard, it was actually interesting because I was fortunate enough there to be able to study with the people who are supposed to tell you how the economy runs. And they tell you about all these things at the macro level. There are people who used to advise presidents of the United States on how to grow economies. But I realized that what they were teaching actually didn't fit. It didn't make sense. In fact, I left the first day of Economics 101 and left the class and never went back because I thought this doesn't make sense to me. Because it didn't take into account folks like my parents. It didn't take into account the ordinary folks trying to build things, creating businesses, creating wealth, building their communities. It talked about economics in an abstract sense, like we were all just replaceable parts in a system. And so my whole life has really been about championing a better way to think about how we create economic growth and prosperity in our communities. And I've come to realize, for doing this over 2 decades now, that the way to do it is not what folks in DC or the economists or the think tanks say. It's actually what you do in places like this room. It's what you do in communities just like this. And it's different than what they teach you in school in places like Harvard. And so I'm here to share what I've discovered and what I've learned over the years in doing this work. So I've been involved I've started businesses, I've invested in businesses, I've worked in communities to grow businesses. I've consulted with institutions, as Cassie mentioned, from the World Bank to U.S. Agency for International Development to governments around the world, but also to communities in the U.S. doing homegrown work and trying to build entrepreneurial innovation. So I've been doing this stuff a long time, and when I was at the Kauffman Foundation, I had a chance to actually look at large across the whole system in the United States, and that's led to me to where I am now. And I'll take you through this journey of what I've learned and what I've seen, and also take you up to this moment we are here today. So how do you create prosperity anywhere? So this is the question of the day. And it's a question I think we all struggle with. It's kind of at the heart of so much of our economic challenges. I've heard people, executive leaders from the World Bank saying, what we're doing, what we told people to do for the last half century isn't working anymore. I've seen communities struggling, trying to figure it out, and they follow the playbook that others have given them, and it doesn't work anymore. So we have to figure out a new way to create prosperity anywhere. And it starts with what we have right now. So I'll start with the story of David and Goliath. So you all know this story. Goliath, the giant, defeated by David with a lucky shot of a slingshot. But the thing about Goliath is this is actually very similar to how we've traditionally thought about economic growth in our communities. We've tended to focus on the Goliaths. So can we recruit Amazon's second headquarters, for instance? Can we recruit the next warehouse? Can we recruit the next manufacturing plant? And 238 cities went after Amazon's second headquarters, and 2 of them won. 1 of them said it was too expensive and backed out. But that was billions and billions of dollars of incentives that these communities were throwing at these types of things. And there's 200 site selection projects like that a year across the U.S. Only 200, and the communities go after these Goliaths all the time. But the thing about it is that David, we think of David as being a lucky shot. And David was the little guy that defeated Goliath. But what if you had more than a David? What if you had lots of Davids? That is, if you actually have lots of Davids, this is what we know actually works. So what we know about economic prosperity is the little guys, if you add up enough of them, can defeat the big guys. They're actually more, you can create more jobs and more prosperity from the little stuff in aggregate than you can from the few of the big things. And so 1,000 Davids beat Goliath, always. In fact, there's data out of Kansas City, where I live, which shows that Amazon promised 50,000 jobs over 5 to 10 years, but the entrepreneurs built 84,000 jobs over a 5-year period. But we don't count them very well. You can't do ribbon cuttings for most of these little businesses. They grow organically. There's no one moment where you can suddenly say, look what we've done. It's all slow, patient, steady growth. Homegrown, up from below, steady as she goes in these communities. And we know that the spirit of these Davids is actually in all of us because they've done surveys. The SBA did the survey. 62% of Americans have a dream business in mind. They actually want to be entrepreneurs. But we also know that 41% of Americans would start within 6 months if they could, if they had the means to do it. But in reality, over the next 6 months, only 2% of Americans will actually start a business. And they come in, entrepreneurs come in all shapes and sizes. Like we tend to think of entrepreneurs in the media as these tech startup, college dropouts in Silicon Valley. But the typical entrepreneur is middle-aged, it's someone just like you and me, trying to start a business, and they come in every possible variety. And they want to start B&Bs or bakeries or tech companies or import businesses or anything. There's so many businesses, and there's so many, I know we're featuring a lot of local businesses here as well. And so this is actually where the Davids are. This is actually the types of businesses that are trying to grow in these communities. So, little known fact, we talk about job growth a lot in our political debates and our national news, but new firms actually drive almost all net job growth. So here's a chart. This is actually a study over almost 2 decades showing where the businesses came from. So the blue line at the top are businesses that are younger than 5 years old. The red line are businesses that are 5 to 9 years old, and the gray line are businesses that are 10 years or older. And you'll find that so the axis on the left is net job creation. That is, after you add up all the job gains and the job losses in each of these categories, what do you get? And you find that the businesses younger than 5 years are the only category that actually create net positive jobs. The midlife businesses at 5 to 9 years actually net out about 0. And the businesses that are older actually net negative over time. They shed jobs in crises, and they might add some back, but they don't really add back everything that they lost. And so when we want job growth, the big businesses create great headlines, but it's the little young businesses that are actually creating the job growth. We don't tend to give that a lot of credit, but that's actually the reality. This is the data. This is what it shows. And they do more than just job growth. In addition to job growth, what do entrepreneurs do? They actually create GDP. So if you track, the researchers have tracked this, where GDP actually comes from when you measure GDP. The GDP growth actually comes from the young entrepreneurs. It helps overcome inequality. We know that the more entrepreneurs there are, the less inequality there tends to be in a community. It raises community incomes. For every 1% increase in entrepreneurs in a community, it raises the average income of households in that community by $400. Lifetime earnings go up. So entrepreneurs, they don't make as much money in the short run because it's hard to be an entrepreneur. But over their lifetimes, they actually make more. Probably because they learn more, they're more risk tolerant, they're able to find opportunities better, they're more adaptive, they're more flexible, they're more resilient. And we also know it helps fight poverty. For every 1% increase in poverty in a state, there's a 2% decrease in the poverty rate in a state. So we know entrepreneurship has a huge effect on the economic life of the community. So generally, entrepreneurship is a good thing. Right? We know it's really important for a community. We don't talk about it enough in general in this country, but we know how powerful it is. So how do we start? What do we do to get there? So I'm going to introduce to you this idea of, they mentioned my book, The Rainforest. But I want to start, instead of talking about rainforest, I want to talk about people. This is a rainforest of people. It's a giant crowd. And so when you look at large crowds, people are kind of indistinguishable from one another. We all kind of blend in together. So it's not that dissimilar from a forest, right? The trees all kind of look the same. If you look high up in the air, if you're up at a few thousand feet, everything just looks like this blanket. And people are the same, which is what the way we look at economies. People all kind of look the same when you're high up in an economy. But if you get down into the trees, you see things differently because the trees start to look different. They start to have individual characteristics, and the trees start to take on their own life, and they start to take on some nuance, and you get this spectacular view. These are the redwoods. This is actually a rainforest, the Pacific Redwood Rainforest out in California. If you've ever been out there, you know how spectacular these trees are, up to 300 feet in the air. But then if you get down even deeper and try to figure out what makes redwoods grow, you can actually look at their seeds. So these are the pine cones for redwood trees. People often don't think about redwood trees as once being that small, but they were, just like everything. So these are the pine cones of redwood trees. And if you break them apart, here's the individual seeds. So these are the little seeds of redwood trees that can grow into 300-foot trees that live for thousands of years sometimes. And you only need one seed out of a billion to make it to keep the redwood forest alive. They shed 1 billion seeds for every one that actually takes root and grows to keep the forest going. I think of these as like little startups. And the thing about redwood trees, which is really interesting, is when they sprout up, their root systems are really shallow. They only go deep about 6 to 12 feet, really shallow, even though the trees are so high, which means they can easily fall down. So what do? They actually lock their roots together, like holding hands. So redwood trees hold hands to shoot up to the sky, and they compete like mad against each other because they're all in a race to the sunlight. So they can actually kill each other trying to get to the sunlight, but they hold hands trying to do it. So it's so interesting because that's kind of like what business is too. You hold hands, but then you compete at the same time. So that's redwood trees. But people are the same. If you think of those seeds, but you think about people and groups of people, just like each of you sitting in these small groups, or each of you in your home, in your businesses, or in your community, we all have these groups of seeds, all of us together. We're not that different from one another. And so these seeds actually are the root of everything. When people sit in teams, when we're actually communicating and working together, we are the equivalent of these seeds trying to hold hands and race up to the sky. And so this is what I want to put that frame in, is when you start to look at whole forests, and you start to look at whole forests that come from these seeds, you get a different perspective on what it is that causes communities to grow. And so this is the idea of the rainforest, which is that innovation comes from highly dynamic ecosystems. where seeds have a chance to take root and grow together. And you want to contrast rainforests with farms. So on a farm, what do you grow? So on a farm, you grow a crop. You know exactly the crop you want to grow, and then you want to maximize the yield of that crop. What do you do when you have a weed on a farm? Well, you don't want weeds. You kill the weeds. Weeds are bad because they're not the crop you want. Well, what's a weed in a rainforest? Well, everything's a weed because you don't know what that seed's going to turn into, and you don't know if that weed in a rainforest is going to become the most important plant in the entire forest, which is very similar to the process of entrepreneurial innovation. So if you want to actually nurture the growth of weeds, you actually want to allow everything to have its fair chance to grow. And the way you grow a rainforest is not by growing crops, it's not by tightly controlling, it's actually by allowing the ecosystem to nurture things to sprout up. And so you control not the individual crops, but you control the environment, the sunlight, the nutrients, the soil, the interaction of the flora and the fauna within the rainforest. So if we want to contrast how things go from weeds to crops, we actually realize that everything starts as a weed. Every interesting product, every interesting idea, from the iPhone in your pocket to everything, started out as a weed of an idea where someone said, what if we thought about trying to create something like that? And then it turns into something that you produce, and you start to yield, and you start to manufacture, and then it becomes a crop, because then it's predictable. So everything starts unpredictable on one side and becomes in predictable systems on the left side, from seeds to full-blown redwood trees, from weeds to crops. And so what we found is that there's actually different sets of behaviors of people in these systems. So how people behave in a rainforest is different from how people behave in a farm. So in a rainforest, we call these the rules of the rainforest. These are the basic behaviors of people that cause innovation. And this is what I learned when I was in Silicon Valley for almost a decade. I actually studied how people behaved. And I realized that how they behaved followed a very different pattern in Silicon Valley than it did in other places around the country and the world. And it was replicable. So one is to break rules and dream. So people aren't bound by the rules of the past. What happened yesterday isn't what necessarily has to happen tomorrow. Open doors and listen. Be open-minded to possibilities. Listen to new ideas. So the person that was a college dropout could build the next company that transforms the world. Someone, if you've heard the story of what Apple looked like when it started out, there were a bunch of smelly hippies, and it became Apple. So you never quite know, and people in the Valley have gotten attuned to that, which is you just never know. Trust and be trusted. Be willing to stick your neck out for people because it comes back around in this karmic cycle. So instead of holding back your trust, actually give it out. Seek fairness, not advantage. So instead of trying to win every battle, see if you can come up with mutually synergistic relationships and partnerships. Experiment and iterate together. Try things out. See if it works before you try to overly plan it, instead of trying to overly predict things. And then err, fail, and persist. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay for it not to work, but try and try again. So these are the basic behaviors. Oh, one more. Pay it forward. That is, be willing to give something into the system instead of trying to do everything as a transaction. These are the behaviors that you find really throughout Silicon Valley historically, not just what it's like now. Silicon Valley's kind of changed now. It's kind of become a bit, it's not quite what it was before, but this is the Valley. If you look at where it came from, these are the cultural behaviors that you can find throughout the system. They became Goliaths, that's right. The Goliaths started to take over the rainforest. So I'll go through the other rules on the crop side. These are the rules of the farm. I'll go through these a bit faster. Excel at your job, be loyal to your team, work with those you can depend on, seek a competitive edge, do the job right the first time, strive for perfection, and return favors. Now, these all sound great too. No objection to any of these. Now, the interesting thing is these are opposites. So these actually partner up. These are similarly positive behaviors, but in different contexts. So if you want to strive for perfection, that's great if you're manufacturing, running a tight manufacturing line. But if you're trying to innovate and be entrepreneurial, you actually want people who are actually able to make mistakes. So you have to be able to switch mindsets. And the Valley, they do this very, very well. They actually know, oh, this is the point when you're willing to try it out. And this is the point when you can't tolerate error. Like, they know. It just becomes embedded in the way they do things. But anyways, very interesting dichotomy of mindsets and rules. And then you can actually reduce these down to one-word values. This is actually even easier. Openness, diversity, serendipity, fairness, experimentation, play, and giving. These are actually the same rules, but in one-word values. And then you can do the opposite. Excellence, loyalty, dependability, success, quality, precision, reciprocity. Opposites, values, all good values, but they change. You have to change behaviors depending on the environment you're in. So when you're trying to be entrepreneurial, we're trying to be David, you're trying to grow seeds, we're on the left side. And then when something becomes big and you want to scale it and keep it the way it is, you do the stuff on the right side. So what happens is when you follow those rules of the rainforest and you start to operate like that in a community, it actually starts to connect everything in the community. It affects everything. It's not just the entrepreneurs by themselves. The one thing about entrepreneurship that's really important to remember is that it's not an activity in isolation. So sometimes in our public life, we see this where people say, oh yeah, entrepreneurs, small business are the backbone of America. That's great, good for them. And that's kind of it. That's kind of how we kind of have treated entrepreneurs, almost like they're on their own. But it actually doesn't work that way. Entrepreneurial activity touches on everything. It touches on every aspect of our society. And that is a challenge because we tend to think of it as a siloed thing. We tend to think of it as like off to the side. But it really is everything in our lives. And what this looks like is these connections and the relationships that form when people start acting like this is it starts to build these deep, deep sets of networked relationships. And so this is actually a study from about a decade ago from scholars at UNC. And it shows that they started to capture the social networks for building innovative companies. And they found that they actually follow certain patterns. So this was a decade ago, this was Phoenix. And you can see the networks where you have different clusters of people that tend to work together a little bit more. It's kind of cliquish. And then in Seattle, you can see it's cliquish, but a little bit less so. You can see they're a little more connected together. And then Boston, it starts to get really connected. And then Silicon Valley, you see this giant hairball where everybody's connected to everybody all the time, almost like a rainforest, right? They start to take on a life. The system itself becomes something bigger than the sum of the individuals. So this is what this looks like when people start acting that way. They start to actually shape the very fabric of their society and their economy. So how do you create 1,000 Davids? So what do you do? So this is what it looks like, but how do we do it? So the answer is actually really easy, which is to be David number one. So it starts with you. It starts with you and how you act and how you behave and how you support the entrepreneurial process in others around you. So entrepreneurship is an activity that you do across an entire community. And so the barriers to entrepreneurship are significant as people are trying to start and grow businesses, from lack of support to lack of knowledge, to lack of funding, to lack of opportunity. These things are always these mountains that stand in the way. And so the job is to help break it down and to help make it easier for people to get through that process. And so what can that look like? Well, support can be very simple. Just open doors for people. You know, help open doors for people that can't get into the door. Build connections, be a mentor, elevate role models so people have stories they can copy and examples to follow. Knowledge, apply K through 16 education. So instead of just teaching people raw skills from a textbook, teach them how to apply those skills out into building stuff and creating things and solving problems out in the world. Entrepreneurial skills, the basic skills of the nuts and bolts of building a business. And share stories on how to do this. One of the most powerful things in a community in entrepreneurship is actually to share the story. So I talked with Pam about this, and they actually ended up sharing these stories of entrepreneurs on their tables, because that's actually how we learn, is through sharing these stories. Funding. So new ways to invest. So a lot of the ways we've thought about investing in businesses don't necessarily fit the businesses today. So be willing to think about new ways of experimenting in capital. Kind of a side a whole side conversation around different forms of capital. Traditionally, we actually have created two forms of capital that we tend to use right now in America, which is banking and venture capital. One is pure debt and one is pure equity. Lots of interesting models now that are hybrids of those, where people start with debt and they convert to equity, or people start with equity and convert to debt. Equity is just stock ownership, if I'm using a fancy word. It's just stock ownership. Or revenue-based investing, or profit-sharing models, or cooperative models, or crowdfunding models online. And there's lots of different things there's different flavors of ice cream now. It's not just the same two flavors. And so that's happening now across the country, is more and more innovation in different types of capital. Be an early customer. When someone's launching something, do you wait to be a later customer after it's tried and true? Or do you step in and say, you know what, I'm going to help them take a shot at this thing? I love backing things on Kickstarter, because I feel like I'm not just buying a product, and sometimes it doesn't show up, to be honest, but that's just part of the process. But I love being part of that process. If you've ever, who's bought something on Kickstarter here before? A few people, all right. The rest of you should try it. It's actually kind of fun, because you don't just buy a product that's really interesting and different. You become a part of the story of the entire entrepreneur. So they give you updates on everything that's happening in that process. You become embedded into their lives. It's actually a really cool thing. Opportunity. So zero regulatory barriers. Break down the barriers. It shouldn't be this hard. We make it so hard to start a business in this country. It's actually more costly to start a business in this country than Canada, the UK, China, Brazil. Chile. It's very expensive in this country to start a business. Fight biases. There are lots of our biases that get in the way. It's just hard for people to get in the door sometimes, and be aware of them. And access to markets. Make it easier to get in the door to compete in the marketplace for people that are starting out. So how do you build your own rainforest? So I'll give you some tools and tips on how to do this. Here's a basic framework that I recently created this. So you start with the rainforest conditions, which is the innovation culture. Cultivate the soil. These are the values and the norms and the behaviors you want. And then you build up. This is the infrastructure, the policy, the capital, the knowledge, and the support. These are the ingredients. And then that creates sustainable prosperity as you grow, harvest, and renew that whole ecosystem. And so these are the basic concepts. You start with the people and how you are, and then you start building out these different pieces of the infrastructure. And there's free tools available. The book, The Rainforest, there's some samples online, and I know they're giving some out here today. There's the Rainforest Blueprint, which is like a short colorized version. It's like a movie trailer version of the book, which is available, downloadable for free online. We've got Rainforest Canvas, which is a tool for actually building out your own rainforest or mapping out your rainforest, and that's free online. And then the Rainforest Scorecard, which is a set of questions and scoring methodology for how you actually track and measure a rainforest, and that's available free online as well. And so if you go to my site, victorh.co, you can actually access these things. And so those are available as tools for you. And here's what the Rainforest Canvas looks like. Here's some of the questions we ask. I know some of the work you guys have done here with Rev and E2 are based on appreciative inquiry. That's kind of this model as well, which is looking at what you had and what's possible to grow, what's working, and how do you nurture it. And so when you do this, you can actually see what this looks like in terms of how this gets affected in workshops and things like that we've done. So I'm going to talk about Right to Start for just a little bit. I've got a few minutes left. So Right to Start is an organization I founded about a little over a year ago. And this was based on really an extension of all of these ideas, which is that entrepreneurship has been missing out on a fundamental advocacy infrastructure, that there's no voice for entrepreneurs in our public life and our policy making. And so we start with the idea that entrepreneurship is a fundamental right. It's a right to start. Just like you have a right to speech, you've got a right to worship, you've got a right to assemble, you have a right to start. You have a right to take your natural God-given talents and apply them to create value in the world, to make your own way, to earn a livelihood, to build a business. And a business doesn't have to be a giant business. It could just be you as a solopreneur trying to do something, but it's your right to be able to do that. And so every right in American life has some kind of infrastructure to support it. If you believe in guns rights, you got the NRA. If you believe in civil liberties, you got the ACLU. If you believe in entrepreneurs' rights, well, now you've got the right to start. You've got an organization and infrastructure that's fighting for you. So we are introducing legislation in different states. We have a Right to Start Act that made it through the Missouri House of Representatives a few months ago. We're getting ready for the Missouri Senate next year. We've got several states that are getting ready to introduce more Right to Start Acts. We've been building out grassroots operations. We have 6 cities where we're building field operations right now to fight for right to start policies and ideas. We have 18 ambassadors across the country that are advocating for these ideas. So we believe it really is a deeply embedded right. We invite you to join and participate in this as we take on the fight to change our system and level the playing field for entrepreneurs. So I'll leave you with this idea of the weed, which is as we think about rainforests and applying the idea of being a seed or a David in your own life, in your own community, we're all kind of pushing against the pavement, right? The pavement is the systems that hold us in place, whether it's the mindsets or the institutions or the legacies that keep things down. And so we're all weeds trying to push to that pavement. And it is not an easy thing. I have a lot of empathy for people that are doing that. And I'm in that world myself, and I know how hard it can be. But do it. You're not alone, even though it feels like you are alone. It feels like you're a weed pushing through the pavement on your own, but you're actually part of a community of people that are doing it together. And the best thing about this, going back to my time, leaving Harvard Economics 101 and realizing that in our economic system, you actually don't matter, is that when it comes to entrepreneurship, you actually do matter. In fact, you are everything. You as the first customer for that product, you as the family member or friend of someone starting a business, you as someone taking a chance to invest in a business or just support someone in your own personal way. You actually matter. In entrepreneurship, every individual has a role, and we all participate in building up our entrepreneurial communities as individuals. So thank you very much. Thank you for being part of this great work. Thank you for being part of this event, and really excited for what you're building here. I've gotten a great sense of what you're doing here, and it's just really, really inspiring and exciting, and there's so much momentum here. And I'm just feel honored to be able to see it and be part of it and support the work you're doing here. So thank you.